Okay, so June 16th, 2015, Trump Tower. Do you remember where you were? I mean, when Donald Trump came down that escalator, I don't think many of us really knew what we were seeing. It felt like, I don't know, kind of a reality show thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of people saw it that way. But it's interesting because as we're going to look at today, that was the start of something really, really big. Huge. Huge.
Yeah.
A real turning point for American politics.
Yeah.
And, it wasn't just about that one election. It was about how the whole Republican Party changed.
Exactly, and that's what we're diving into today.
Yep.
The source material you guys have is Chapter 15 of Society Ooze, and it's called Trump's Seismic Impact on American Politics. We really want to drill down into how Trump changed the GOP, like totally reshaped it. I mean, beyond the crazy headlines, we all remember what were the fundamental shifts. And to get started, I think we need to remember what the Republican Party was like before Trump. What was that traditional platform that he kind of blew up?
Right, so think back to Reagan. The Reagan era. That's the Republican Party that a lot of people think of as the classic version.
Totally.
Pro-business, religious conservatives, strong national defense.
Mm-hmm.
Reagan called America the shining city on a hill.
Mm-hmm.
Right. This idea of optimism and America as this great force in the world.
Totally.
That was the kind of language and the policies that Republicans were known for.
Mm.
And then Trump comes along and he's like completely different.
Yeah, his language was so different.
Completely different. I mean, his inaugural address, he talks about American carnage.
Right.
Like the opposite of a shining city on a hill.
Mm.
It's this idea that America's broken and it needs to be fixed. And then, of course, there's his whole drain the swamp thing. He's saying the system is rigged and corrupt and we need to get rid of all these bad people.
And that idea of America being broken, that really fed into his nationalist message, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, remember that rally in Michigan?
I do, yeah.
Where he said, I'm not running to be president of the world. I'm running to be president of the United States.
Mm.
And the crowd went wild.
Yeah.
And that's something that Conkiel and Dolan really gets into, is that Trump really tapped into this feeling among a lot of Republican voters that their concerns were not being addressed, that the party had become too focused on global issues and not focused enough on what was happening here at home.
Right, and it wasn't just the policies, it was also the style. I mean, he was so different from the typical politician, and that's something that was clear right from the beginning. Think about Jeb Bush, right? Please clap moment in New Hampshire.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that just sums it up. This total disconnect between the establishment and, a lot of these voters.
And Trump just completely threw out the playbook.
He did, yeah.
He wasn't using teleprompters. He was improvising at his rallies. He was insulting people. Like everything that you're not supposed to do as a politician.
Yeah, and Shamanoli really gets into this. Like, they talk about how Trump connected with voters on this really emotional level. It was like he was saying the things that they were thinking, but felt like they couldn't say.
Exactly.
Like that line about Mexican immigrants, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. That's something that would have destroyed any other candidate's campaign.
Oh, absolutely.
But for Trump supporters, it just made him seem more authentic. Like he wasn't afraid to say what he really thought, even if it was offensive.
It made him seem like an outsider, which I think was so important to his appeal.
Right. Like he was not part of the system. He was going to come in and shake things up.
Right. And part of that shaking things up was giving everyone nicknames.
The nicknames, yeah.
Low Energy Jeb, like Little Marco, Lion Ted. Like, it's kind of funny, but also kind of brilliant, Yeah,
it's like this very simple but effective way of undermining his opponents.
Yeah, like you can't take someone seriously once they've been branded with one of these Trump nicknames. And it also reinforced this image of Trump as the strong leader. He's the one who's in control. He's the one who's calling the shots. And I think for a lot of his supporters, that was really appealing.
Totally. And it all fed into this incredible loyalty that he built with his base. I mean, this is something that we've never really seen before in American politics.
Right.
He could say or do anything, and they would still support him. I mean, remember that quote, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, and I wouldn't lose any voters. Like, that's a crazy thing to say.
It is. And it's something that the source material really highlights because it shows how different Trump was from other politicians.
Yeah.
Like he wasn't beholden to the same rules. He had this direct connection with his base that was incredibly powerful.
And it had a huge impact on the Republican Party itself.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, think about Lindsey Graham. He was one of Trump's biggest critics in the beginning.
Yeah.
And then he becomes one of his most loyal allies.
And Sasanche talks about how that happened with a lot of Republicans. They either got on board or they got pushed out.
Right. Like Justin Amash.
Yeah.
He criticized Trump, and Trump called him a total lightweight and a loser.
Yeah.
And eventually Amash left the party.
And it's like, it wasn't just politicians, it was the whole base. You know, like, remember at that rally in 2018, they started chanting, "Lock her up." But they weren't talking about Hillary Clinton.
They were talking about Liz Cheney.
Exactly.
Wow.
Which shows how much the party had changed.
Yeah.
You know, like it was no longer about ideology or policy. It was about loyalty to Trump.
And that loyalty, it wasn't just political, it was cultural.
Right.
Like that red MAGA hat became this symbol. Like you would see people wearing it and you knew exactly what they stood for.
Yeah, it became like a uniform.
Totally.
And it's something that Shan Gaylon talks about, how the MAGA hat became this symbol of identity. You know, like it was a way for people to show that they belonged to this movement.
Yeah, and it all ties back to that line from his inaugural address, the forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer.
Yeah. Like he was speaking directly to people who felt like they had been left behind.
Mm-hmm.
You know, people who felt like the system wasn't working for them.
Right, and that was part of this bigger trend, right? Like this rise of populism that we saw all over the world.
Exactly. So you had Brexit in the UK, you had Orban in Hungary, you had Bolsonaro in Brazil. It was this global phenomenon.
Yeah.
And Egid Idan connects Trump to this broader trend and talks about how there were all these shared factors, you know, like economic anxiety, cultural change, this feeling that the elites were out of touch.
And that anxiety about cultural change, I think that's what really drove Trump's message on immigration.
Right.
I mean, you can't talk about Trump without talking about immigration. Like, that was one of his signature issues.
Totally. And it was so central to his appeal. You know those lines about when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists.
Yeah, like that was so powerful for his base. You know, because it tapped into these fears about crime and security and cultural change.
Right.
And then, of course, there's the wall.
The wall. Like, that became the symbol of his whole approach to immigration.
And Shi Taiyane talks about how effective that was, you know, because it was this simple, concrete solution to a complex problem. Like it was something that people could rally around.
It was. And then there was his economic message, which was also really interesting. Like, here's this billionaire, right?
Yeah.
Who's supposedly the embodiment of the elite. And yet he's connecting with blue-collar workers in a way that no Democrat has been able to do in decades.
It's true. And I think part of it was that he was willing to talk about issues that other politicians were ignoring. Like he talked about trade deals that he said were hurting American workers. He talked about factories closing down. He talked about the decline of the middle class.
Right.
You know, like at that rally in Pennsylvania, he said that globalization had benefited the elite, but left American workers with poverty and heartache.
Yeah. And there's that quote from the steel worker in Youngstown, Ohio. Trump's the first person who seemed to give a damn about us in decades.
Yeah. Like that really captures the feeling that a lot of people had that Trump was on their side, that he understood their struggles.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you also had this cultural nationalism piece too, right?
Yeah.
Like in his inaugural address, he talked about patriotism and how there's no room for prejudice.
Yeah.
But then his administration implemented the travel ban, and his rhetoric about immigration was often really divisive.
Yeah. That's a tension that Carrie-Anne Latte really gets into. You know, like on the one hand, Trump was appealing to this sense of national pride.
Right.
But on the other hand, some of his policies and his language were really exclusionary.
Yeah, like those build the wall chants and the America First slogan, like those things really resonated with his base, but they also alienated a lot of people.
And they represented a real shift away from the traditional Republican approach to foreign policy.
Right. And then there's the whole anti-establishment thing. Like drain the swamp became this rallying cry for people who felt like Washington was broken.
Absolutely. Like they felt like both parties were corrupt and self-serving and that nothing ever changed.
Yeah.
And Sinal Ondon Ace quotes this retired auto worker in Michigan who says, "I voted for both parties my whole life. They're all the same, all talk, no action. Trump's different. He's not one of them."
Wow.
And I think that really sums up the appeal of Trump for a lot of people. You know, like he was this outsider who was going to come in and shake things up.
Totally. And the way he used Twitter was also part of that outsider image, right?
Oh, yeah.
Like he just bypassed the media completely.
Yeah. Like he had this direct line of communication with his supporters, and he didn't have to go through the filters of traditional media.
And he was really open about why he did that. I mean, remember that quote where he said, "I use social media not because I like to, but because it is the only way to fight a very dishonest and unfair press"?
Yeah, and Akshisha Ondi talks about how that was part of Trump's strategy. Like he wanted to control the narrative. He wanted to be able to speak directly to his supporters without having his message distorted by the media.
And it worked. I mean, he dominated the news cycle for years.
He did.
So let's fast forward to the 2022 midterms. Like, those were seen as a big test of his influence within the Republican Party.
They were.
And the results were kind of mixed, weren't they?
Yeah. Like a lot of his endorsed candidates won their primaries, which showed that he still had a lot of support among the base.
Yeah.
But then a lot of them lost in the general election, which suggested that maybe his appeal wasn't as broad as it once was.
Right.
And Akshisha Ondi talks about how that raised questions about the future of the Republican Party. Like, is Trumpism still viable, or is the party going to move on to something else?
Yeah, and Trump's response to the midterms was interesting. He said, I am not going anywhere.
Yeah.
And his base seems to be sticking with him.
Good do.
So as we look ahead to 2024, it's clear that Trump is still a major force in American politics.
He is.
And even if he doesn't run himself, his influence is going to be felt.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like any Republican candidate is going to have to figure out where they stand on Trump.
Right. Like, are they with him or against him?
Yeah, and there's this quote from a Republican strategist that Suen Taimi uses that I think is really telling. He says, there's no going back to the party of Romney and McCain. Trump didn't just change the party. He is the party now.
Wow.
Like, that really sums it up.
And it's created this real division within the GOP.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
You have the traditional conservatives on the one hand and the America First wing on the other hand. And they don't always agree on things.
Right. Like, they have different views on trade, on NATO, on the role of government.
Yeah.
And it's a division that's going to continue to play out in the years to come.
And then, of course, there's Trump's relationship with the media, which was just unlike anything we've ever seen before.
It was.
He was constantly attacking the media, calling them fake news.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he was also incredibly good at getting media attention.
He was. And Sankoniel talks about how Trump understood the media better than anyone. Like, he knew how to get attention. He knew how to create controversy.
Yeah.
And he used that to his advantage.
Absolutely. And one of the results of all this is that America feels more divided than ever.
It does.
It's like we're living in these separate realities.
Right. And so Antonio Aon talks about how Trump contributed to this polarization. Like, his rhetoric was often really divisive. He talked about his opponents as enemies.
Right.
And he really tapped into this feeling that a lot of people had that the country was in danger.
Yeah. Like, remember that quote from his 2019 rally where he said, these people are trying to destroy our country. We're not going to let them.
Yeah. Like, that's really strong language.
It is. And I think it's fair to say that Trump has had a profound impact on American politics. Like, regardless of whether you love him or hate him, there's no denying that he's changed things.
Yeah. And Thuy Courtier quotes this historian from Yale who says that we'll be analyzing the Trump phenomenon for generations. He exposed fault lines in American society that were deeper than anyone realized and harnessed them with remarkable political instinct.
Wow.
Like, that's a pretty powerful statement.
It is. And I think when we look back at the Trump era, it's clear that it was more than just a few years in the White House. Like, it was a real turning point in American history.
Yeah. Like, Swintenu argues that Trump represents this fundamental realignment of American politics.
Yeah.
And it's a realignment that's going to have lasting consequences.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with this big question, right?
Yeah. What is the future of American politics?
Like, are the changes that Trump brought about temporary or are they permanent?
It's hard to say, but I think it's something that we're going to be grappling with for a long time.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes this whole topic so fascinating. Like, it's not just about Trump, it's about America.
Right.
Like, he exposed all these deep divisions within our society, and it's up to us to figure out how to move forward.
Yeah. And one of the things that Seiko No touches on is how Trump really understood the power of resentment.
Yeah.
Like, he was able to tap into this feeling that a lot of people had that they had been wronged, that they had been forgotten.
Right.
And that's a really powerful emotion. And it's something that we need to understand if we're going to heal these divisions.
Absolutely. And it all goes back to that tweet that he sent out in 2018. They're not after me, they're after you. I'm just in the way.
Yeah.
Like, that's a really interesting statement because it can be interpreted in so many different ways.
He can.
Like, some people see it as a sign of Trump's strength. Like he's standing up for the little guy.
Right.
But other people see it as a sign of his paranoia. Like he's creating this us versus them mentality.
Yeah. And I think that's part of what makes Trump such a polarizing figure. Like people see him in such different ways.
Yeah. So to sum up, based on our deep dive into Sejong Audiap, Donald Trump really did reshape the Republican Party. He used this combination of nationalist and populist appeals. He connected with his base in a way that no one else could. And he was willing to break all the rules.
Yeah, and the result is a party that is very different from the one that existed before Trump.
And the big question now is what happens next? Like, what does the future hold for the Republican Party, for American politics, for America itself?
And I think that's a question that we all need to be thinking about. Like we're living through a really tumultuous time in American history. And it's important to understand the forces that are shaping our country.
Absolutely. And I think Sejong Audiap does a really good job of laying out those forces. Like it's a really insightful look at the Trump era and its implications for the future.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's definitely worth a read.
Absolutely. So for all of you listening out there, I hope this deep dive has been informative and thought-provoking.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.
And as always, keep those minds curious.
And keep learning.
And one last thing to ponder. All these changes that we've seen within the Republican Party, could this be a sign of something even bigger? Like, is this just the beginning of a whole new era in American politics, an era where the old rules no longer apply, where anything is possible? It's a thought, isn't it?
It is. And I think it's one that we're going to be wrestling with for a long time to come.
Yeah. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
See you then.